Okay, so I'll start just so we can start on time and people will continue to file in. So first off, thank you to everyone who is joining us from wherever you are in the world. My name is Justin Reash, and I'm the Executive Director of the International Churchill Society, which is an organization dedicated to educating current and future generations on the legacy of Sir Winston Churchill. And you can learn more and support and become a member of the society by going to a very easy to remember website, which is winstonchurchill.org. So this conversation today is going to touch on Churchill's dedication to human rights. And I'm pleased to be joined today by two esteemed guests from India. Before I introduce them, however, I have two items of housekeeping. First, this conversation is being recorded and will be available on the Society's YouTube page in the coming days. Second, I know my two guests would love to answer questions from the audience. So please use the Zoom Q&A function to submit your questions, and I will be monitoring those and identifying those that we'd love to ask the guests as we get past the presentation and discussion. So now allow me to introduce these two guests. Mr. Ankit Malhotra is currently studying law and has written, published, and spoken extensively on international relations and international law. He co-founded the Jindal Society of International Law, which has hosted international speakers from the Law Commission, United Nations, Institute of International Law, World Bank, and Hague Academy of International Law. Mr. Zareer Masani is a historian who has spent decades as current affairs producer for the BBC and is now a freelance historian, journalist, and broadcaster. He has presented and produced several documentaries for BBC Radio 4. Zareer's particular areas of interest are UK race relations, British imperial history, and the legacy of the Raj in India. He has also contributed to many magazines, including the Society's quarterly magazine, Finest Hour. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.
Well, let's get right into it. And Ankit, if I could ask you to begin your presentation, I will share my screen and we will move forward. Please give me one moment. Can this be seen on the screen?
Yeah.
Yes. So let me thank the International Churchill Society for giving perhaps its youngest speaker to share something which is rather close to my heart, and also something which deeply inspires me. Before we went on air, I was just sharing this with Justin. Of course, Dr. Masani already knows this, the motivations and interests that one developed by visiting the Churchill war rooms before the pandemic and before our lives changed forever. This, of course, became a project which I undertook in my course for human rights and law and theory, and which I shared with the Churchill family and also the society, which was deeply admired and appreciated. And I was, I must admit, quite shocked to hear the words, and also quite intrigued, fascinated, and also quite honored, to be honest, to see what the family had to say, and also the society. And thus, here we are to speak about Churchill and his efforts towards human rights. Now, I've been very intentional, and some might say also cheeky, to title it as Churchill's fight for human rights, given how we understand Churchill today and the perspective that one has developed on Churchill based on the narratives, or the rather cross-cutting narratives that flow around him. But I've also titled it as On Sinews of Speech, Sinews of Peace, which is a speech entitled, which was part of the speech entitled The Iron Curtain, which Churchill delivered at Missouri in the United States of America on the 5th day of March, 1946, which packed a formidable punch. But the context in which the speech was delivered was quite complex and different. Despite its title and the widely quoted sentence, which is what the speech is known for, which is from Stettin in the Baltic to the treaties in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. This, of course, is in reference to the USSR. But Churchill was never to shrink away from a challenge. Churchill did battle with words instead. and the amazing ability to combine the showmanship of the memorable phrases with deep substances is something which all of us are in awe of. Dr. Andrew Roberts, the famous historian of Churchill, wrote in the last paragraph of the first volume of his war memoir, when he quoted Churchill and said, and I felt he was walking about the day he became prime minister. I felt as if I were walking with destiny, and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial, end quote. The speeches he delivered, Churchill delivered at the time, were some of the most powerful ones in the English language. His words were defiant, heroic, but also very human. They reached out to everyone in Britain, across Nazi-occupied Europe, and also throughout the world. As the famously written by journalist Beverly Nichols wrote, he mobilized the English language and sent it to battle. But what is to be made of his speeches, and how did Churchill's words affect the outcome of the Second World War? What you see on your screens now, ladies and gentlemen, is Churchill strolling in the grounds of his country home, Chartwell Manor, on the 31st day of October 1939. What I wish to undertake in this presentation is to revisit Churchill's efforts on behalf of European unity in light of his human rights politics and views on international law. It also traces the undercurrents that germinated towards the origins of Europeanism across the decades of the first half of the 20th century. Churchill's understanding of Europe as a Christian ethical community of peoples was derivative of his prior Atlanticism, imperialism, and most importantly, romantic sensibility. Surrounding events of devastation shape his vision of Europeanism and empower his support for the adoption of a European human rights movement. Particular attention and focus is also provided in this presentation on Churchill's involvement in the Congress of Europe at The Hague in May 1948, and thereafter the following measures. The crux of this presentation is to shed light on the diplomacy and the ensuing legal jurisprudence on human rights in the aftermath of the Second World War. The orchestrator, the pioneering human being, and the primary activist and social collectivist leader is all these efforts is Sir Winston Churchill, hence the title, Churchill's Fight for Human Rights. Justin, I'm just going to request you to let me know if the slides are moving. Or I have to seek access. Yeah.
I've approved access.
Right. I don't wish to spend too much time on Churchill's childhood and also the Second World War, because these are facets that the members of this august society will be quite privy to, and perhaps will know even more than I do. But his early life really belongs to this aristocratic family, the Spencer Churchill family, who were the Dukes of Marlborough, but his mother was American. After enjoying a privileged childhood, Churchill began his education at Harrow, a top London school for boys. And in Harrow, he starts to develop this dry humor with which all Britishers are also famous for. And on this instance, I'm reminded of a conversation that Andrew Roberts had with Neil Ferguson of Stanford University and of the Hoover Institute, who spoke about this incident which took place at the war rooms at the crucial junctures of the war, and an instance which actually took place in the bathroom. Churchill and this other military leader were going on with their business, but Churchill did not wash his hands, and the military leader did, who came out and said, at Eton, we were taught to wash our hands after doing our business. Churchill, in his dry humor, remarked that at Harrow, we were taught not to do our business on the hands. So these instances and other instances really formulate an understanding and also a perception of Churchill, and also the dry humor for which he's known, and also for which he becomes infamous for in the latter parts of his life. Now what you see on our screens is his early political career. Churchill is also famous for holding all important ministerial positions except that of foreign minister. But as his life is witnessed, he perhaps did more of foreign diplomacy than perhaps any other leader of his generation, and also perhaps of mine. In the Second World War, Churchill, in the 1930s and latter part of the 1939 aspects of the year, the Second World War broke out, and in 1940, Churchill becomes Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and leads the war efforts with quite a lot of grit and confidence. Justin, I'm just going to make a small request. I think the slides are moving.
Yeah, that was my mistake. I apologize. Sorry about that.
So, we're still moving. Right. So, just continuing here, and even with the photographs that we do see, I've been a little bit intentional with those as well. What we see, at least the photograph, the bottom is Sarah Churchill. Now, Sarah Churchill is an interesting character, and what is very much even more interesting is the account provided by Catherine Grace Katz, who was spoken for this society and who charts the journey of Sarah Churchill and other women who played an integral role in not only recording but also acting as aides to their fathers, his father being FDR and also Averell Harriman. But the rationale behind this, the story behind this, is that Winston Churchill and Clementine Churchill had decided that a member of the family must accompany the Prime Minister on his travels as his confidant, supporter, as well as a chronicler of the human life and of the family and its history. Clementine and 20-year-old Mary had joined their father, Winston, in the first Quebec conference in August 1943. But by this time, the Prime Minister had requested Sarah to accompany him for the upcoming conferences with FDR and Chiang Kai-shek at Cairo, and FDR and Stalin at Tehran, and in late November and early December. On the 12th day of November, Sarah and her father departed from Plymouth on board the HMS Renown. They sailed to Alexandria via the Straits of Gibraltar and then flew to Cairo to meet Chiang Kai-shek and FDR on the 22nd of November. So Sarah Churchill actually spent a lot of time with her father, and she acted as a right-hand man to her father. And I've actually shared an account which is also hyperlinked to a longer article published on the International Churchill Society's website, which discusses this relationship at great length. And I'm quite thankful to Catherine Grace Katz for chronicling this relationship quite wonderfully. But I just want to take an instance to share or to relive the process.
Reminiscent of shell-torn French towns in the last war, people in the martyred city of Plymouth derive some comfort from mobile canteens following their tragic ordeal. Plymouth has been savagely wounded. There's no denying it. With homes gone, people group around the friendly field kitchens and, with the working parties of sailors and soldiers, help with the sad task of tidying up. And yet they can still make fun and laugh at a man carrying his bed on his back. Plymouth was home to them once. Now they seek refuge away from the tragic heaps of bricks and tiles that once were cottages, villas, and bungalows. And in the midst of it all, the cry goes up, "Here comes Winston!" Accompanied by Mrs. Churchill, the Prime Minister of Great Britain and his wife come to be with the indomitable people of Devon.
What is this sovereign remedy? It is to recreate.
I'm just going to pause that here and take a moment to speak about the after-war periods as a point of introspection, not only for Churchill, but also for everyone in Europe. What we were about to hear was a famous speech by Churchill when he speaks at the University of Zurich, advocating for a United States of Europe, urging Europeans to turn their backs on the horrors of the past and look to the future with much more sagacity, adroitness, and also willingness. Churchill declared that Europe could no longer afford to drag itself forward with hatred and revenge which sprung from the injuries of the past. He thus asked for a European family of justice, mercy, and freedom to build a kind of a European United States of Europe. But what essentially gets created from this is a Council of Europe. The Council of Europe predates the European Union, of which the United Kingdom just exited. The Council of Europe is much bigger than the European Union. The Council of Europe has 47 members, whereas the EU just 28. The UK became a co-member of the COE at its inception in 1949, some 24 years even before it joined the the European Union. The UK's membership of the Council of Europe is completely unaffected by its participation in the EU or the lack of it now. But let us just hear what Churchill himself had to say with respect to the United States of Europe. I add these small anecdotes of Churchill himself so that we can relive that specific moment and transform ourselves back to those times of glory, sagacity, and also statesman.
What is this sovereign remedy? It is to recreate the European family, or as much of it as we can, and to provide it with a structure under which it can dwell in peace, in safety, and in freedom. We must build a kind of United States of Europe. In this way only will hundreds of millions of toilers be able to regain the simple joys and hopes which make life worth living.
Already spoken a little bit about the Council of Europe, but Churchill was convinced that only a United States of Europe, or a version of it, could guarantee peace. His aim was also to eliminate the European ills of nationalism and warmongering for once and for all. He formulated his conclusions drawn from the lessons of history and from his speech at the University of Zurich, which he titled as a speech to the academic youth, which he gave in 1946. Thus, the driving force behind the anti-Hitler coalition became an active campaigner for European cause of unity. With this plea for a United States of Europe, Churchill was one of the first advocates for the European integration to prevent the atrocities of the two world wars from ever happening again, calling on the creation of the Council of Europe as its first step. In 1948, in The Hague, 800 delegates from all European countries met with Churchill as the honorary president at the Grand Congress of Europe. This led to the creation of the Council of Europe on the 5th day of March 1949, the first meeting of which was attended by Churchill himself, and his call to action can be seen as propelling further integration as later agreed upon during the Messina Conference in 1955, which led to the Treaty of Rome 2 years later. It was also Churchill who would first move the idea of the European army designed to protect the continent and provide European diplomacy with some muscle. Furthermore, the European Court of Human Rights was created in 1959, a decade after Churchill first campaigned and championed this idea, which we will speak more about. Providing the inspiration for this and the people of Europe is the binding factor in the Allied war against Nazism and fascism. Winston Churchill consequently became the driving force behind the European integration and an active campaigner for this cause. Let us now, from history, move to the legal aspects which formulate the heart of this discussion. Churchill, at this point of time, has inspired this movement, which will now be carried forward by others, such as the conservative politician and British lawyer David Maxwell Fyfe, who also goes on to become the UK's Home Secretary. Churchill spoke about this idea of the Human Rights Charter, and he spoke about the strength derived from our sense of common values. The Charter being, and I quote Churchill here, guarded by freedom and sustained by law, which ensure that people own the government and not the government the people. This is directly from the speech which he gave at The Hague in 1948. The UK was also one of the first states to sign the European Charter for Human Rights on the 4th of November 1950. Governments that joined the Council of Europe must sign up to the convention and make a legal commitment to protect the EC, to protect the human rights of those in their country. Let me just also note that it is the country's citizens, country's residents and not citizens. There is a legal difference in this, but let me just park that there and also just say that the ECHR today protects 820 million people in 47 different countries, ensuring basic human rights and standards for all. Importantly, the countries that created the ECHR, such as the UK, and also set up the European Court of Human Rights to oversee whether the governments are meeting their obligations under the ECHR. Until the Human Rights Act of the United Kingdom was passed, the only way that people could access these rights was to invoke a case in the European Court. Of course, it is rather unfortunate that my guru, Mr. Gopal Subramanian, could not join us for this discussion due to an urgent meeting. He could have spoken at length about the jurisprudence of this convention and also the charter. The convention, which you now see on your screens, ladies and gentlemen, speaks in Churchill's words of what it entails to do. The European movement pursued these ideas at its second Congress in Brussels. The British leaders worked on this draft and ultimately became the Human Rights Convention. So from the Charter to the Convention, which therefore creates the Court. This is, of course, deeply inspired by the UN Declaration on Human Rights. The court is also responsible for creating its body of judicial mechanisms and also its jurisprudence. The court, as we all know, is based in Strasbourg and was decided upon in 1949. Let me also speak about the convention and the benefits that the citizens have yielded from this. We've already seen these aspects of the convention, but let me just stress about the convention and the jurisprudence around it. Jurisprudence essentially suggesting what the convention has done since it was created. All 47 members, including the United Kingdom, have signed the convention, and the Convention for the Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms is the full name of the convention, and it contains a list of protocols and amendments to the articles which relates to the right to property, free elections, and many other issues of common interest to all citizens. The European version has also inspired the creation of the African version and also the American versions of this convention. So all of this essentially traces back to one individual, which becomes the nexus point for this convention, and also the jurisprudence and protection of human rights to a larger level than just Europe itself. I also wish to spend a bit of time on the convention and the articles which it speaks about, which is namely Article 1, which speaks about the obligation to protect human rights, that the state has a responsibility to respect the individual's rights as set out in the convention. Article 3, which speaks about prohibition and cruelty, inhuman and degrading treatment. Nobody under any circumstance can torture or abuse anyone. We should never be treated in ways that cause us serious physical or mental suffering. Article 4, which speaks about prohibition of slavery and forced labors. I'll also speak about a few cases on this respect and others which I highlight in not only the presentation, but which I am reading out as well. Article 8, which speaks about the right to privacy and the respect of family life. The right to privacy became an important issue which was discussed in a recent case of Puttaswamy, in which Mr. Gopal Subramanian was involved heavily. The other article which I wish to discuss briefly is Article 10, which speaks about the freedom of expression, and Article 12, which speaks about the right to marry, Article 14, which speaks about the prohibition of discrimination on any grounds such as sex, race, color, religion, language, political or other opinions, national or social origin, association, and belongingness to a particular religious class or political belief. The European Court of Human Rights applies and protects the rights and guarantees set out in the Convention on Human Rights. This convention is also responsible for other facets, and I just wish to speak about these facets, in which it can be classified or understood as something as a living instrument. In this regard, what is interesting is highlighted by Baroness Brenda Hale of the United Kingdom, and she speaks about Lord Stanky, who quotes as human rights objects not being instruments, because instruments essentially require a person. For instance, a piano requires a pianist, violin requires a violinist, rather as living trees, as living organic objects which grow on their own and therefore can be classified as living beings or living objects of nature which inspire us quite deeply. The human rights are for all, and the best and the worst will aim at the discussions which were laid down by leaders like Churchill and also FDR, but who was also responsible in the human rights aspect in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is Eleanor Roosevelt. Let me just take a small moment here to speak about Eleanor Roosevelt and the account given by Catherine Grace Katz on Eleanor Roosevelt and her relationship on human rights and the internal family drama that takes place. That's a fascinating account, which I strongly encourage everyone to look at and also observe. The only country in Europe which is not a part of the ECHR is Belarus, Europe's last dictatorship. Even Russia and Azerbaijan, countries who have a less than stellar human rights record, are a part of this convention. Even then, the ECHR law does not go beyond the 47 countries of which it is a member. It makes a judgment when something is incompatible or has outlived its utility in the domestic laws of a nation and protected under human rights, and lets the government decide the question on the incompatibility vis-a-vis the laws. Now, speaking about the convention, it is also important to realize what scholars of not only international law, but also of international legal history and also of human rights have to say. In this regards, let me just share what Professor Marty Koskiniemi has to speak about human rights. He says, when human rights emerged in the international discourse, human rights lawyers said public international law is just state-centric, whereas human rights lawyers have different values, different concerns, different human rights laws than public international law have. Nothing to do with us and from our discourses. Human rights are a regime so that they are set up as special bodies such as European courts, such as the European Court of Human Rights. He also speaks about the Loisidou case, which is a case of refugees wishing to return home from their former homes and to get access to their properties. He speaks about the European Court of Human Rights in respect to this Turkish citizen, Tina Loisidou, and consequently all other refugees that have the right to return to their former properties. The ECHR ruled that Turkey had violated the Loisidou's human right under Article 1 of the Protocol 1 of the European Convention on Human Rights, and that she should be allowed to return home and that Turkey should pay the damages to her. Turkey initially ignored this ruling and made a declaration saying that the convention should not be applied with respect to Northern Cypriots. The court is now confronted with how to understand Turkey's denial of jurisdiction from the court. In public international law, there are standard ways of understanding reservations of such. For example, under public international law, general treaty laws are either accepted or a reservation is made, and the state is member can have this reservation, or you don't accept the treaty at all. Now here, the European Court didn't want to get into these sticky situations. It wanted to give justice to the Greek complainant, but that was possible only if Turkey had accepted and become a part of the convention, and that had erased its reservations to this convention. Thus, recommendations and rulings of the dispute settlement body cannot add or diminish the rights of obligations and are provided under coveted agreements so that its technical wordings for the same regime are protected. The European Court of Human Rights, in another case, also seemed to use these political leanings of the court or its human rights leanings in respect to the situation. So let me just leave this question open to the audience members here. In which way do you see human rights different or as one part of an international legal regime which was deeply inspiring and also motivating and can be traced back to an individual who we all learn from? Since I believe I am primarily speaking to a British audience, what I did was to look at a few case laws regarding the United Kingdom and the European Convention on Human Rights. But since we are short on time, I shall only speak about the aspects which relate to human trafficking and domestic slavery illegal. In 2002, a woman traveled to the United Kingdom from Uganda to escape sexual and physical violence. A relative who lived in London helped her to get a false passport and a visa documentation to enter the United Kingdom. But when she arrived, he took her documents, and the relative arranged for her to work as a live-in carer for an elderly couple. She was required to be on call for 24 hours a day, and her wages were sent to the relative. In 2006, she went to a local bank to alert the police of her situation. Before the police arrived, she collapsed in public and was later diagnosed with HIV and psychosis. After leaving the hospital, she was told by the police that under the UK law at the time, her case was not considered to be of human trafficking. She then applied to the court in Strasbourg, saying that the United Kingdom had failed in its obligations under Article 4 of the ECHR to properly investigate her case, probably because it did not have a effective law to deal with forced labor such as this issue. The European Court agreed and found that the United Kingdom had inadequate support to protect her rights. As a result, the United Kingdom abolished such practices and created the Modern Slavery Act of 2015. There are other cases also which I've listed down, and they're all hyperlinked to links which take you directly to these cases. But for the shortage of time, let me move on to the other aspects which I wish to discuss. So that's just, while it is an enjoyable little clip, it is legally off, if I could put it that way, or it is legally incorrect. Let me share why. That's because the convention or many of the rights that it gives is said to be given as in the British notion or the Christian notion of God giving Moses the 10 Commandments existed in some form before anyone had ever thought of the European Convention. Think slavery, for example, which was abolished by England and Wales by Lord Mansfield in the discussion of Somerset versus Stuart in 1772. Or the precise contours of that developed in the 50s, fair trial standards and the notion of privacy, freedom of religion, non-discrimination were far from unknown to the legal system of Britain. This is recognized towards the end of the film, of course, when one of Prime Minister Stuart's colleagues recognizes the role of British lawyers and British law in drafting this convention. Furthermore, the Good Friday Agreement certainly requires Northern Ireland Assembly to comply with the convention, thus suggesting that we would need to make peace all over again if Britain withdrew is plainly untrue. WTO agreements, the World Trade Organization agreements, frequently incorporate the provisions of other treaties that are binding on the member states. The point here of my analysis is not to nitpick these faults from the film. As a political enterprise, certain dramatic license is understandable. The suggestion, however, is that this maintains the main achievement of the European Convention was to bestow upon a grateful relationship to the British people and the rights that were previously unknown to them, as well as to subsequent admissions that wasn't the case, that makes the film hopelessly confusing. My main concern is that it's confused the British account of the benefits of the European Convention and gives fodder to those British advocates voting for withdrawal, which of course is something which can take up another discourse altogether. I also share the British version of the European Code of Human Rights, the Convention on Human Rights, which essentially is a direct copy of what the convention speaks. I should not invest further time because we are on a small time frame, and I'd also like to hear what Dr. Masani has to say. There are a few challenges to the European version and also the British version of the Human Rights Act. I've highlighted these, and of course, these slides can be made available later on as well. Let me also produce this final documentary in which we hear David Maxwell Fyfe speak on the European Convention on Human Rights as an account of
human rights. Why are they so important? And are they British? My name is David Maxwell Fyfe. Let me tell you my story. 1945. World War II has just ended. The Allies capture some of the leading Nazis who'd almost destroyed civilized Europe. The world demands justice. I'm a British Conservative politician and lawyer, and have been sent by the British. Let me tell you my story. 1945. World War II has just ended. The Allies capture some of the leading Nazis who'd almost destroyed civilized Europe. The world demands justice. I'm a British Conservative politician and lawyer, and have been sent by the British government to prosecute the Nazi leaders at the Nuremberg trials, a landmark event for international justice, where we showed the world the full extent of horrors the Nazis had committed, where we sought justice. It got us thinking, how do we stop these horrors from happening again? We realised the road to the gas chambers was paved with the denial of the basic rights of Jews, of gypsies, of homosexuals. How could we better protect those rights? The answer was human rights laws. The idea of human rights had been building for hundreds of years, to not just say that people had the right to life, the right to freedom of religion, to freedom from slavery, freedom from arbitrary arrest, freedom of speech, but to enshrine those rights in law. So after Nuremberg, the international community came together. I and others created the European Convention on Human Rights, the first time in history where all the things a person needs to be free were set down in writing and protected by law. Friends, now as in my time, some argue that we don't need human rights laws to protect people from the state. Let me tell you, the lessons from Nuremberg must never be forgotten. As years pass, memories fade. We forget that the cruel barbarian is not behind us, but always underneath us, ready to rise up. We must always be vigilant. At Nuremberg, we saw the lowest of humanity. In the aspiration of human rights, we see the highest. Every generation must understand what happened in those dark times and renew and strengthen its commitment to basic human rights. What could be more British than that?
Let me just share final thoughts. What we see now on our screens, ladies and gentlemen, is Churchill feeding dares in Richmond Park. He's accompanied by his private secretary and personal detective. This photograph was taken on the 25th of March, 1963. Just to end, I'm sort of reminded by what Alfred Lord Tennyson said when he said, though much is taken, much abides, and though we are not that strength which in old days moved heaven and earth, that which we are one equal temper of heroic hearts, made weak by time and fate, but strong in will, to strive, to seek, to find, but not to yield. These, of course, I can supplement only with my visits to the Churchill War Rooms in 2019 and the inspiration I found there. I'll finally close by a photograph just shared by my dear father, which really represents the different facets of Churchill and the kind of personality that he had. I think this perhaps is the perfect way to stop, and I'll now invite Justin to come back and moderate the show.
Thank you, Ankit, and thank you for that and very well researched and very well produced presentation. I don't think we've had, at least since I've been here, of the past 2 years, a discussion on the such wide-ranging connections between Churchill and the human rights that are enshrined in international law that we now know. So thank you very much. And so I'd like to now introduce Dr. Zareer Masani, who of course I introduced at the beginning of this conversation, a distinguished historian and author. Dr. Masani, your responses to Ankit's excellent presentation.
I have to preface it by saying I am not a lawyer and I am not an expert on the European Convention on Human Rights and the case law which Ankit went into. I'm not sure that Churchill would have approved of equal rights for homosexuals. I think he was very much a creature of Victorian 19th century culture. He was born in Victorian times. I'm here to really talk about his connection with human rights, which was fairly complex. So I would like to go back to, well, firstly, I think his early years in India did not impress him at all with India's capacity to govern itself or reconcile its communal differences, which is why he was always rather opposed to democratic rights in terms of one man, one vote, or one woman, one vote being transferred to India, where it could lead to a very majoritarian system. And that's what was, I think, underlying a lot of his opposition to constitutional changes in India. He was also a great believer in the British Empire and its civilizing role. I think much before he had any concept of human rights, he believed that the British Empire was promoting universal values which everyone could benefit from. And he also reacted very strongly against incidents of racism and brutality in the British Empire. So I would like to spend some time on his response to the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, which some of your listeners will know happened in 1919. It involved the death of about 380 people in a peaceful demonstration. Thousands, about 1,500 more were wounded, caused by a small firing squad of Indians led by a British officer, General Dyer. This was debated in the House of Commons that year. Dyer had been recalled. The House of Commons, led by Churchill, who was then Secretary of State for War and therefore in charge of Dyer, debated his conduct, and with Churchill's leadership and a very powerful speech from him, censured Dyer and called for his removal from the army. Churchill, in that speech, which I think is worth, I mean, I don't have the quotes in front of me, but he referred to monstrosity as being alien to the British temperament and to the British Empire, and to monstrosities of this kind being very un-British, and that there was no place for them in the British Empire. So he condemned the Jallianwala Bagh massacre in no uncertain terms at a time when the Tories, he was then a Liberal, the Tories in opposition supported General Dyer, but the government, with Churchill's support, carried the day in the House of Commons. So that was his first venture into human rights. Indirectly, he didn't see it as being, particularly about human rights in the sense we now talk about them, but it certainly showed his concern for universal values. Then we come to the period of the 1930s, when he opposed constitutional change in India under pressure from the Indian National Congress led by Gandhi. He saw the Congress as very much an upper caste dominated body, which would not be fair either to untouchables, Dalits, or to Muslims. And I think he was proved right in the century that followed. And he felt that in a majority-dominated independent India, the upper caste would dominate. And he saw Nehru, a Kashmiri Brahmin, as very much epitomizing the dominance of the Brahmins continuing. He was very cynical about Gandhi's fuss and felt they were a form of moral blackmail. And, he also was not impressed by Gandhi dressing in a loincloth when he visited Buckingham Palace, and felt this was, both disrespectful to the King Emperor, but also, a very cheap way of kind of scoring points. So he was not a friend to Indian independence for these reasons. He fought in opposition in the 1930s, because he was in office during World War I in the Liberal coalition, but he was in opposition in the 1930s as a conservative backbencher. He opposed constitutional change in India for those reasons. He, however, at the same time, had very close links with the German resistance to the Nazis, which was basically within the German High Command, within the German Foreign Office. There were plots to remove Hitler, in collaboration with the British. Chamberlain did not cooperate with the German resistance. Churchill did. However, Churchill was still in opposition. And had he been prime minister, it's quite possible that he would have achieved regime change in Germany by promoting a coup within before the Munich conference of 1938, when Chamberlain basically surrendered to Hitler and told him he could have Czechoslovakia. Churchill, was certainly proved right in his assessment of the Nazi threat to human rights across Europe. And he felt quite strongly about the persecution of the Jews. Churchill himself was quite racist, as most Victorians were, including most Indians. Indians are still very racist in their color prejudices. You only have to look at the matrimonial columns. So racism was pretty ubiquitous across the world in the 19th century. Churchill, was not free of it, but he nevertheless did not believe in any form of racial oppression. And his views, where he talked about Indians breeding like rabbits, were when he was furious with the Indian National Congress in the 1940s for what he called a stab in the back during World War II, launching the Quit India movement. So Churchill saw this as very much a betrayal of the British Empire. And he saw the Congress as being a Hindu-dominated body that, sort of was dominated by the upper caste and did not have the best interests of the Indian people in mind, let alone the British Empire. He was much more friendly to India's Muslim minority. He had very good relations with the Muslim League leader Jinnah, who, like him, feared majoritarian Hindu domination. So his concept of human rights was never to see majority rule as being ensuring human rights, because he could see that majorities could be very oppressive and result in ethnic cleansing of minorities and so on, which is what happened, for instance, in the state of Kashmir, which was a Muslim majority area where, India sort of took over and now has even abolished its autonomy. So I think the way that the Indian state has developed very much has proved Churchill right on its inability through majority rule to be fair to its minorities, and its ability to overcome casteism, which is more rife in India than ever before. So I think Churchill's views in those respects have been more than justified. And for those reasons, as I say, he, had very good relations with the Muslim League and Jinnah. And when the Congress basically refused to share power with Jinnah under the cabinet mission plan, which envisaged a loose confederation between the Muslim majority and Hindu majority areas of India, the Congress turned it down because Nehru wanted a centralized state. And Churchill very much sympathized with Jinnah's demand for Pakistan in response to that. Pakistan was always a bargaining counter for Jinnah. So I think I will stop there, because I am not, I do think Churchill's views evolved, and certainly his attitudes to India from his late 19th century experiences as a young cavalry officer, which were not very pleasant, down to his later relations with people like Nehru, whom he welcomed to the Queen's coronation in 1953. He accepted Indian independence, although it came from a Labour government. One final thought on his attitudes to Europe and what came after World War II. I think Churchill would not have wanted to surrender Eastern Europe to Stalin, left to himself, but he had to deal with the fact that the Russians had boots on the ground in Eastern Europe in the way that the Western allies didn't. And secondly, he didn't have the full backing of Franklin Roosevelt, the American president, who was partly because Roosevelt was in very poor health, and partly because Roosevelt's administration had to some extent been infiltrated by Stalin's spies. So Stalin always had advance information about whatever Roosevelt was planning, and therefore what Churchill was planning. So the Western allies were always at that disadvantage, that the American side of things had been infiltrated by Stalin, and Churchill, left to himself, would have taken a much firmer line with Roosevelt and Stalin about not surrendering Eastern Europe. He did make quite a point about the fact that Britain had gone to war in 1939 in defense of Poland when it was invaded by the Nazis, and to now surrender Poland to Soviet-dominated communism, which is what happened after the war, was a contradiction of having gone to war for it in the first place. So he was a great friend to Polish independence and to the Polish government in exile, which was later betrayed by the Tehran and Yalta conferences, and Poland handed over to the Soviets. So I think I'll rest there. I think his concern with the Council of Europe, etc., came later and was partly a response to the Iron Curtain. And I'm not sure that the European Convention on Human Rights in itself would have protected Churchill's vision, because, I mean, the very fact that Russia is a signatory to it indicates that it can be cast aside at will, even by its signatories. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Masani. And Ankit, before I ask for your response, I'd just like to say a few things. So first off, Winston Churchill was somebody is one of probably the best example, not the best, one of the best examples of how humans change over time. Dr. Masani, you brought up a very good point. Churchill was experienced in India and the Northwest frontier as a young cavalry officer, where it was not pleasant, and he wrote not pleasant things about the people that he encountered. However, through age, through maturity, through an open mind, which is what Winston Churchill always had, he was able to come to the point, as you said, to accept Indian independence, and probably understood himself that he helped unleash the self-determination movement throughout the British colonies with the Atlantic Charter, signed, of course, with FDR. Actually not signed, but endorsed with FDR. And then furthermore, the comments that Winston Churchill was always tagged with, especially that of Gandhi, I can't think of it right now, a very, very negative comment, was actually hearsay. It was Leo Amory, who was in his cabinet, saying Churchill said to me. So if you're a real historian in any way worth your salt, you'll take that as a secondary hearsay source with a big caveat compared to a primary source. And the Churchill Archive Center is full of primary sources, of course, at Cambridge. So I encourage anybody who really want to understand what Churchill wrote and said to always consult the primary sources. So we have a few questions, but Ankit, I'd like for you to reply, and then we'll answer those.
I'll be quite brief because we'd like to take the questions. Russia ceases to be a member of the European Convention on Human Rights as of 16th of March 2022. which answers your question there. But the commitment made was essentially that you have to sign up to the convention in order to get the economic and financial benefits. So essentially, human rights were used as the bait to sign up to this larger family of Europeanness, or the European relationship which these nations wish to share, and also the economic relationship which they would have gathered from one another. The last point, at least the second point I wish to make over here, is to reflect on a writing by Mrinalini Sinha in 1994 when she spoke about gender in the critiques of colonialism and nationalism, locating the Indian woman. Now, why I share this is because I've been quite fascinated by studying women of this generation, and a woman who's deeply inspired me and whose information and knowledge I found when I visited Somerville College at Oxford a few years ago. Now, this woman is Cornelia Sorabji. Cornelia Sorabji was a fascinating woman. That is because Sorabji's primary interest in campaigning was of social service, but she was a barrister. She was a barrister who was trained in India, but was also a woman who supported the British Raj because of the upper caste Hindu woman and the opposing rapid reform which they sought to brought, which was essentially what Dr. Masani was also reflecting on, believing that until all women were educated, politically informed, and reformed, they did not provide any real and lasting value. She also opposed the imposition of Western women's perspective on the movement of women's rights and women changes in India. So that's a deeply inspiring woman who challenged the status quo, but of course was shunned to one corner just because that her belief in the British Raj was considered at the central nexus of all her thinking and all her belief. So this perhaps is another personality which requires further understanding and also a deeper appreciation of. Justin, I'll stop there.
Yeah, great. So go ahead, Dr.
If Cornelia Sorabji, whom I much admire, I wonder if she ever met Churchill, because she certainly would have admired him and certainly was very critical of Gandhi, and basically had to leave India and emigrate to Britain because the Congress basically stopped her being able to practice in India because she was so opposed to the Congress. Interested to know. Anyway, yes, she was a great figure.
And she's commemorated and celebrated, unfortunately not in the Indian courts, but in the Gray's Inn and also in Somerville College, where there's a large portrait of hers.
There's a bust of her in the inner temple.
Gray's Inn, yeah. Indeed.
Well, so we have just a few questions with the left time. If I can start. So one question from Catherine Shannon. It's an important question. It's not related to what you discussed in terms of the human rights, European human rights, but the question is about what can you say about Churchill's role in supporting the Black and Tans in Ireland in 1920 who violated the human rights of Irish people? Obviously, and let's say this: the brutality which it was of the Black and Tans, who were former soldiers, military soldiers, brought in by the cabinet under Lloyd George to attempt to suppress what then turned into, of course, the Irish Civil War and Irish independence. Of Winston Churchill was certainly endorsed the inclusion of those military troops. However, and this is what happens often with Winston Churchill, is it's people portray his participation as if he was directing the troops on the ground. He endorsed their inclusion to help with the fighting in Ireland, but he didn't direct them to sack cities. He didn't direct them to have basically at times illegal murderous actions. And then he, of course, decried what they did. So, did he have a role? Of course he did. He was, as the Colonial Secretary, was responsible for the responses. But at the same time, he was not directing these people to do the things that they did. Very similar to the Bengal famine in the sense of he's currently portrayed in some parts as the one person who killed millions of people in Bengal, But how can one man kill 3 million people from thousands of miles away? And if you understand the British Raj and of course the British colonial structure, there was a viceroy below him, and below him there were multiple regional leaders, especially in Bengal. So it's not like Winston Churchill waved a pen and all of these atrocities happened. Does he bear responsibility? Of course he does in some way, but there's much more nuance and much more facts that are often left out. So sorry, Ankit, I saw you raised your hand.
I'll be doing a injustice if I speak on the Bengal famine before Dr. Masani shares his opinion.
As far as the Bengal famine, I don't think the Bengal famine, really was for Churchill a human rights issue. Bengal was under an elected provincial government, which was primarily responsible for food supplies. It took a while for the Viceroy's administration to realize there was famine because of wartime speculation and shortages. By the time the Viceroy realized, and Wavell was the Viceroy Churchill had appointed, Wavell kept asking the War Cabinet for more supplies. Churchill didn't meet his full demands, but nevertheless, 1 million tons of food grains were supplied over that crucial year. So the famine didn't last for more than a year, although some of its after effects continued. And the famine, as you say, was, due to a chain of command, which Churchill was pretty removed from 6,000 miles away, fighting a world war. This was 1943, when the war was very much on a knife edge. There were famine conditions in Southern Europe. There were Japanese submarines in the Bay of Bengal, which made it nonsensical to keep diverting food grain shipments from Australia across the Bay of Bengal. So there were all sorts of reasons why the response was not as quick and as total as it should have been, but to blame any individual is quite meaningless. I think on the black and tans issue as well, it's worth remembering that black and tans did commit a lot of atrocities, but so did Irish Republicans, whom they were fighting. There were no saints in that civil war, and the civil war involved a lot of Irish people killing each other. So the black and tans were participating in a pretty violent struggle.
Thank you, Dr. Masani and Ankit. So a couple questions. Ankit, do you know if the United States signed the European Declaration of Rights? I don't think they would.
Justin, that's a question.
You're not, US are not signatories to the human rights, which is why the Hague Court has no jurisdiction over the US.
Yeah, and here's a great question from Randolph Churchill, great-grandson of Winston Churchill and president of the International Church Society. Thank you for tuning in, Randolph. He wants to know from Ankit, do you think Churchill was driven by the failure of the League of Nations in the 1920s to push for some sort of European Council?
Quote his great-grandfather back to him. Success is not final, failure is not fatal, it is the courage to continue that counts. I think Churchill was so deeply inspired that he did not see anything as a failure. He always saw an opportunity in whatever instances he undertook. At this point of time in Churchill's life, he'd reached a stage, wherein he could make a big speech and then retreat back to Chartwell. So this is the kind of time space we are working with, at least studying his involvement in the Council of Europe. So it's true that the League of Nations failed, but the mission with which the League of Nations was propounded still lived, and the offspring of this then became the United Nations, in what Churchill understood as the United Nations organization. It still lives, and the United Nations and even international law lives and exists, and even in the times in which this is challenged, the language of international law remains extremely important and is used by all perpetrators.
Thank you. And I will end with the question. This is from Merton Schill. Would you say that Churchill's support of the Balfour Declaration supports the human rights of Jews to have a homeland for themselves? Well, I mean, it's true. Winston Churchill supported the creation of Israel, the state of Israel. So I would think that, of course, that is a explicit support of the Jewish state to have homelands for themselves. So there is one last question. So I will ask this question because I think it's great. And Ankit, and Dr. Masani, if you have a response to this, just came in, and then we will close after this question. But I think it's a good question. Both sides of the EU referendum were keen to claim Churchill's legacy. That is an understatement, Robin. They both wildly claim Churchill's legacy. But her question is his question. What is known of his views on the optimal level of European political integration? I don't know if either of you would like to attempt to answer that.
I don't think, his references to a United States of Europe would go down very well with Brexiteers today, who constantly go on about how the European Union has tried to create a United States of Europe, which is against everyone's national interest. So I think Churchill was not your typical Brexiteer at all. I think he was in favor of European unity, but I think the European unity he would have liked to see was including Eastern Europe, not the sort of Western Europe that the European Union ended up with.
Let me just add to that, Justin, if you would allow me.
Sure.
Is that this idea of a United States was rather provocative and also hip and also, let me say, sexy of that time. Even Gaddafi imagined the idea of United States of Africa. So this idea wasn't just common to Churchill and the belief of the United States, but the British have always been wary of a larger uniform system of governance, and which is why perhaps explains their let's say attitude towards the European Union. But if they championed an idea, they obviously believed in it wholeheartedly, which is why the Council of Europe lives on and lives parallelly, perhaps also more strongly than the European Union.
Thank you. And my 2 cents to this, and then we'll close, is that, Churchill, one of the many reasons, of his initial interest in the United States of Europe is the sense of collective security. And going through fighting and of course, leading in 2 world wars, which is something many people forget. I always like to remind people, Winston Churchill served at the front of World War I and served the soldiers and led the soldiers. Is that collective security was something that was shown to not have been achieved at the Versailles Conference of 1918. And so being able to prevent another world war, of course, was something that, we all, including Winston Churchill, would want. And though that legacy is now, of course, bearing fruit in Ukraine, is what type of collective security matters in Europe. And I think your point, Ankit, about Eastern Europe is very important. And so it was more about collective defense. But gentlemen, thank you very much. Ankit, thank you very much for your very well-produced presentation. Dr. Masani, thank you for your time. I really appreciate both of you. And thank you all for attending wherever you are in the world.